Welcome back, everyone. So now that we have React Router DOM and we have an idea of how routing works, let's just go over with our final application what it is that we need to build. We know that inside of our actual application, we've simply implemented this component, the directory component. What we need to do now is we need to separate the couple pages that we have. We know that this directory component primarily lives on the home page, which is the page that you have when you land on the website. We know that there's also a shop page, which will render this directory of all of the different collections that are available. And then we also know that deeper down, we have this further library page that contains the products for a related category. So what we want to do now is we want to think about what we want to break up. So currently we have no pages, no routing setup. Everything lives on the main page, and even on this main page, we notice that this navigation component also is intended to persist while we navigate through the website. So this kind of harkens back to that lesson where we were talking about how routing works. And what we're essentially saying is that the home page should be the component that renders when your URL is just the base URL. This navigation bar should always persist no matter what different page you navigate to. And then at the very least, we'll have a couple other pages based on this route changing. So let's start implementing some of this stuff with React Router DOM. Let's go back to our application. In order for us to confirm and tell our application that we want to use React Router DOM, what we need to do is we need to actually wrap this entire application in a router component that React Router DOM gives us. I want to do it in the index.js because this is where we render the app as its entirety. So I want to wrap it as well in this same file. To do so, what we need to first do is we need to import the browser router component from React Router DOM. If you're wondering why there's a browser router, the browser router is the generic router. It leverages the URL in order to keep track of the history of where the user is navigating through, and it behaves as you typically would expect any kind of routing based on URL to behave. There are other forms of routers inside of React Router DOM, but you won't really use them a lot. And at least for our application, most of it is going to be working with the browser router. The other variation ones you can take a look at. Once you understand essentially how routing works overall, there's just a couple nuanced detail differences between them. So it's still relevant for you primarily right now just to focus on the browser router. Now, the browser router, as I mentioned, is a component. So that means it behaves like a component. There's an open tag and a closing tag. And what we want to do is we want to make that the parent of our entire application. So we want to make sure that we save this. And what happens now is that because we've wrapped our application component inside of our browser router component, we can access all of the different features that come in React Router DOM specific to this browser router that is now going to control all of routing inside of our nested application. If that sounds confusing, don't worry. It'll make sense once we start going through it. So let's start thinking about what we need to break up. Right now, app represents our entire application. However, it renders the directory directly. We don't want that anymore. Instead, now we want to render a home page, and the directory kind of just lives on the home page. So in order to do this, what we want to do is we want to actually set up some components to help us. And these components we're actually going to make a new folder for, and we're going to say that these are our routes. Routes is a folder that will hold all of our route top level components. So let's do one so we understand what we're talking about here. I'm going to make another folder inside of the routes folder called home because that's the route we're trying to make. And I'm just going to call this home.component.jsx. This is not some specific naming structure you have to follow for React Router DOM to work, but this is just the way that I like to break up this application. So it's very clear to me what the separation of concerns is because the components inside of the routes are related to routes. They're not these generic components that we're building that we can use in numerous places. Essentially, these home components or these route level components are really only used for routing. And I'll talk about more about that once we get to the portion where we use them. But first, what we want to do inside of our home component that I've just set up here is we want to actually replicate what we had inside of our app. Because this right now reflects almost the entirety of our application homepage. So just copy this entire file over, paste this in, and instead of app, let's call this home. Similarly, we want to make sure that we make sure to export home as the default. So nothing new here. This is really the only difference. Another thing we might have to do is we have to fix this relative pathing, because right now we're probably not actually going to the correct place. So what we want to do is leverage the autocomplete. And from here, we know that we're going to see home. What we want to do is go to components. So there we are pointing to our components folder, and then that in turn will point to directory and get the directory component file. So here, this home component is really all we're looking for. So just to make sure it's still working, what we're going to do for our entirety of our app now is just import home from routes, home component. And instead of rendering all of this, I want to just render the home component. This is just a test that this component works. Remember, even though it's nested inside of the routes folder, it's still just a generic component. It's just a functional component that returns what we had before inside of our app.js. But now we're just exporting it as a component and then just returning it. So it's just an extra step of rendering an additional component, but everything is the exact same. Let's just go back to our application, make sure everything is working. Everything is still working. So let's go back. What we want to do now is we now want to actually leverage routing so that we know how the routing works, with this actually being the thing that only renders when the URL is pointing to home. So to do this, what we need to do is we need to import the routes component from React Router DOM. So routes is a specific component that we get back. And we also need to import a route component. It's with these two components that we can actually assemble the routing at our application level. So I want to take routes, and just as we did, we want to wrap anything that is going to be routable inside of this routes component. Let me just fix this bracket here and fix some indents. So what essentially routes does is that it allows this application to register these route level components that will then in turn render a specific component when it matches this specific route that you're looking for. So how do you know what route you're trying to match? Well, the way you do that is you actually give it a specific path variable. Path is going to be a string, and the string is going to try to match whatever you give inside of it. So when you want to match, say, just a slash, this in turn will say, okay, when I match path slash, meaning that because this is at the base URL level, when we just land on the URL, then I'm going to match. So you can kind of see slash as in this is the end of the path we're trying to match to. So this is the relative path. And what I'm going to say here is that the moment this matches, I want you to now render this element. Element in this particular case is the component. And this is going to take literally a rendered component, and I'm going to render in the home component. So now I want to save this. And what we should expect to see in our application is that nothing has changed. So here we see everything still working. Let's just also quickly open up our developer console. We see there are some generic errors for dev tools, or not errors, but warnings. So everything is actually still working as we expect. But in case you're a little confused about this, because we learned a lot very quickly, and we have to kind of scaffold some of this out before I can deep dive into this topic, let's just take a look at this. As I mentioned, if you want routing to appear in your application, here we have to say, oh, there are these routes that I'm going to leverage and show you in these components. You're saying that by using this routes component, I expect there to be some routes inside. And the moment you match a route where the path value matches the string, then I want you to render this element. So let's be even more experimental. I want it to specifically be when it's at /home, then I want you to render the home element. Here, if we go back now, we actually see, remember, we're on the base route, which as I mentioned is the single slash, as you can see here. We in fact even get a warning that says no routes match for location /, which makes sense because we are not rendering anything for this route. We are trying to match /home. So if we navigate instead to /home, here we see the component rendered. So now we can see how we're rendering specific components based on the route, as in the URL that we are specifically navigating through. So here we are enabling that functionality, as I mentioned. I want you to render specific components based on the URL, which is exactly what we're doing. So if you're a little confused, don't worry, we'll do a lot more practice and we'll do a lot more experimenting with this library because it's a little complicated if you've never come across routing before. So don't worry. If any of this was confusing, rewatch the parts of this video where we walk through implementing these routes because there's a couple steps and they're all pretty crucial. We'll definitely explore them though in the upcoming videos. So this is how we set up our home page. Let's continue in the next video.